All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to AMHA's 2023's conference. Thank you for being with us. For those of you were with us since 4:30 this afternoon, we had great presentation, and we have another great presentation right now. This panel for now is going to be on psychological assessment. We have Dr. Monica Babayan with us and Dr. Rene Karamians, which we will have about 1 hour together. So let me introduce also myself, and then I'll introduce our presenters, and we will get started. Dr. George Garibian. I'm a core faculty at California School of Professional Psychology Alliant in LA, and I'm also the education committee chair of AMHAS. So this is our third annual conference of AMHA, and we are glad that every year we are bringing great presenters, and our goal is to serve our community, to educate and to increase awareness related mental health. So our panel, as I said, is going to be on psychological assessment. Our first presenter is going to be Dr. Monica Babayan. Dr. Monica Babayan is a licensed clinical psychologist and pediatric neuropsychology fellow at Insight Collective. She received training from medical and psychiatric hospitals, community mental health settings, private practice, and academic settings. Dr. Babayan firmly believes that early identification alongside the implementation of appropriate interventions and accommodations can change the course of a child's academic future and overall social emotional well-being. Dr. Babayan is also passionate about raising awareness in her own Armenian community and has dedicated her dissertation to explore the relationships between acculturation and locus of control, life satisfaction, and quality of life. Her presentation title is called Barriers to Neuropsychological Assessment in Minority Communities and the Implication of Avoidance. Dr. Babayan, we are ready to hear your presentation, and thank you again for being here and doing your presentation.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. So, like Dr. Garibian said, my presentation is titled Barriers to Neuropsychological Assessment in Minority Communities and the Implications of Avoidance. Does it look like it's in presenter view right now? Should I change it? What does it look like on your end?
It shows both sides. It's not just one major one.
Let's pretend that didn't happen.
Okay.
I'm gonna reshare my screen. Give me 1 second, sorry.
It's okay even if it's like this.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on. I wasn't doing this earlier.
It's all right.
There it
Okay,
is.
now
There you go. I'm so sorry. Okay, so I want to start off with a little agenda of what we're going through today. So Dr. Grabian beat me to the introduction. I was going to introduce myself and give you that part before I started my presentation. We'll be going over stigma, barriers to treatment, different types of neurodevelopmental disorders, a little spiel on what avoidance means, earlier interventions and paths to achieving an assessment, and suggestions for future directions. So the first point that we're covering before we get into all that is, what is neuropsychological assessment? I understand that some of our viewers will be from Armenia and not from here, and we have very different methods of working with children. So just for general understanding of what my work entails, At Insight Collective, we tend to do full neuropsychological batteries where we go through intellectual and cognitive functioning, academic achievement, attention and concentration, executive functioning skills, and language is broken down into receptive language, expressive language. We often look at pragmatic language and social cognition. We go through motor and visual motor functioning, which includes fine motor skills, sometimes gross motor skills. We assess for verbal and nonverbal learning and memory profiles. We look at children's emotional and behavioral functioning. And if they're old enough, we look at personality development as well. So our work consists of a very thorough 2-day, 8 to 9 a.m. all the way until 3 p.m. just battery of just about everything. So that being said, parents often come to us with a specific referral question, and then we find much more than what they asked for. And that's one of the beautiful things about neuropsychology. So when we talk about why people don't seek assistance, a lot of it has to do with stigma. And just to give you an overview, stigma comes in many different shapes and forms. In general, traditionally and culturally, people tend to associate mental health assistance with feeling weak, or there's a lot of shame around it. There's very different views that people have, whether it's religious or historical beliefs, if it's cultural. In general, everyone has a different approach to what they think that mental health is, and their views are often really the core of where these barriers come from. So the image on the right, you'll see that these are just like common things of what people say that you don't necessarily know that it's mental health stigma, but it is. So sometimes we'll hear things like therapy and medication are just scams, like they just want to take your money, we don't need it, or why can't you just get out of bed, what do you mean you're depressed, like as if these things don't actually exist. Or my favorite one is when people say it's in your head, but it actually is in your head. That's where all of it lies. You'll hear a car alarm outside right now. I hope it will stop soon. So moving forward, when we're talking about what are some other barriers to mental health, the stigma that we spoke of, that's usually the biggest one. Stigma prevents people from seeking assistance, but there are many other factors, and it's not just the fact that we're Armenian and we don't believe in mental health. There's far more to it, whether it's in this country or in Armenia or in minority communities in general. One of the things that really impacts whether people will seek out assistance, whether it's therapy, whether it's assessment, is social support. So if individuals feel like they're not being supported by their family and their friends, or if their friends hold that stigma and they're going to shame them or look down upon them, that's one big reason that people don't seek the assistance that they need. Here in America, something that we hear very often is like, I can't afford it, whether that's minority communities, whether it's like general majority American population. But what people don't know is that a lot of the times their insurance covers it. What people don't know is that a lot of times there are like nonprofit organizations, there's places that will do this for free. Your schools are entitled to help you. So that leads into like lack of awareness and education. So sometimes it's lack of awareness towards what's out there. Sometimes it's lack of awareness of how do I proceed to get what I need. And other times it's just in general, like if you have no idea where to start, it makes it very difficult for you to end up seeking out services. So access to services also relates to that, but with the added caveat of sometimes the nearest center is like 100 miles away. We live in Los Angeles, so we tend to have a lot of everything around us, but that's certainly not the case for people living in Fresno, let alone people living in some of the rural areas in Armenia. So that's something that's very, very essential, and Zoom has made that very more accessible to some people, but in some places in our country especially, it's still difficult to get any of those services. So part of that is also cultural and language barriers. And I say that just aside from the stigma, there's often, in my office at least, like previous office that I've worked in the core of Glendale, I've had families that come to me who are Armenian, but they only speak Armenian. So they're like pretty new here in America. So these language barriers still persist, even if they've now came to this country where neuropsych assessment is a thing and it's like available to them. That doesn't necessarily mean that they can receive those services. And another thing is just fear of medications, fear of side effects. And that doesn't just include medications, that also includes like side effects of therapy or side effects of doing an assessment. People often think about like what this entails. If we open up the jar or open up the bag, what's going to come out, and how do we, if we unveil stuff, then what do we have to do? So fear is something that's very real in people's minds. So I want to present to you some of the common neurodevelopmental disorders, and I'm not going to go into these in much detail, but I can send you the link for a DSM if anyone needs it. But essentially, the core neuropsychological or neurodevelopmental disorders that we see are intellectual developmental disorders, which used to be called an intellectual disability, communication disorders, which which have language disorders, speech sound disorders. Stuttering is included in there as childhood onset fluency disorder, social pragmatic communication disorder, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, specific learning disorders, and motor disorders, which have developmental coordination disorder and tic disorder. And these are the things that are like commonly assessed in any office that's working essentially with pediatric populations. And what I want to pose here is that when there is a lot of stigma in a minority community, majority community as well, we often hear a lot of things that are associated with these words. So I want to flip this to common misconceptions that we hear about, or, you know, sometimes it's implicit biases, sometimes it's within you and you might be thinking these things, but people often attribute intellectual disabilities to a child being dumb or a child being slow. They have these thoughts about this kid is never going to get a job. They have to rely on their parents forever. When we hear things like language disorders and speech sounds disorders, a lot of times parents will say like, he'll grow out of it or she'll grow out of it. That doesn't necessarily mean like we have to take them to services. Like my kids started talking when they were 4 and that's normal. Or I don't know if you guys have heard like he got scared or she got scared. That's a common one with stuttering. There's a myth that can cause stuttering. We sometimes hear that only children have social communication difficulties because they haven't been exposed to other children. That's part of why this diagnosis exists, as well as like children just being shy. And we know that it's not that simple. With autism spectrum disorder, we hear that these are the awkward kids. These are the weird kids. With ADHD, people just assume it's boys being boys. Like they'll grow out of it, they'll grow up. Usually when it's girls or it's the inattentive type, they have their head in the clouds. Like they're just not paying attention. It's ditzy and it's cute to be like a girl who's unaware of what's going on around you. And a lot of the times people will just blame parents and say this child is just not disciplined. When it comes to learning disorders, we hear the assumptions that these children are weak in school, like school isn't for them. They'll do sports instead, or they'll inherit someone's business. And that's not necessarily how it works. People think that parents just must not care to teach them, or that why doesn't this mom take their kid to tutoring? But it's not that simple. It's not bad teachers. It's not bad parenting. It's not this child's fault. But these are like common misconceptions that pop up. And with motor disorders, you know, it's just an uncoordinated kid. It's fine. My kid's not good at sports, or they're just nervous. That's why they're not performing well. And these misconceptions here are part of the reason why people don't seek assistance in the first place, because it's kind of brushed under the rug when you attribute like false things to it instead of understanding where it comes from and understanding that these are neurodevelopmental in nature. A lot of it has to do with, like I said, it's in your head. So it's not something that you can control. But this is the first step to awareness, like really understanding what all of this means. So I have a specific slide for avoidance does not equal absence. And I want to pose just the idea of the fact that as Armenians, we're very underrepresented in research. So for this presentation, for my dissertation, for anything I've ever done on Armenians, it's a very hard, like, very hard to find anything really. And what you do find is often not peer reviewed or not from some published journal. It's just a bunch of people like us who did dissertations, and that's sometimes where it ended. But it's important to acknowledge that avoidance does not mean absence. Just because we are not admitting it doesn't mean that it's not there. Just because we aren't seen in the research doesn't mean that it's not there. And just the general idea of we can't walk around just making these assumptions about what these things mean just because we haven't gotten assessed, we haven't gotten a diagnosis. It doesn't mean that you don't actually have these things. And I think that's like a very important thing to really recognize. So we want to move towards a model of acceptance, which is much healthier than avoidance. And the reason we want to do that is because of all the negative implications of avoidance. And we'll talk about that later. But I do want to introduce early interventions and paths to assessment. So this is for here in the United States. And one of the most important things that you can do is early screening and assessment. So like Dr. Garabian had said, one of my great passions is early intervention and getting things started and figuring out like what's going on very early in life in order to essentially have the best prognosis possible. So a lot of the research says that the earlier we start the interventions, the quicker the gap closes between neurotypical and what is not considered neurotypical in a child. It also improves many other things that we'll talk about later, but essentially early screening and assessment is one of the most important things. The people who are doing these early screenings, a lot of the times it's pediatricians, it's your PCPs, your primary care physicians. What a lot of people don't know is that the regional center is also a source that will provide these free services. There may be longer wait times, but it's a great in and it's supposed to be free for parents and families. And similar with the Early Start, Head Start programs that are in most like preschools and very abundant again in LA, some other places not as much, but these things do exist. So when we talk about early interventions and what these programs offer you, that includes like speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, behavioral interventions, whether that's applied behavioral analysis like ABA or floor time therapy. We have social skills group, we have training for parents and educational interventions. So those include like the intensive reading interventions or just tutoring in general. And then another important thing when we're talking about intervention is school involvement. So there are many ways to ask for services from school, and essentially school is obligated to protect you and give you those services under the American Disability Act. Another thing that comes up, which is kind of related to stigma and related to the lack of awareness and lack of knowledge, is the fact that a lot of people don't want to involve schools. They don't want this to go on their children's records. They don't want this to prevent them from ever getting a job. But what they don't realize is that the reason we do this is because we want to promote equity. It's not considered equality if your child who needs the services is not getting the services. If your child needs extra time and is not getting extra time on tests, that's not equal. You won't reach equity that way. And people also don't know just the facts of this doesn't prevent you from going anywhere in life, really. Like having a learning disability or ADHD, like you can get accommodations on MCATs and bars and LSATs and all these things. And people don't know that these exist. They think that it's going to harm me if people know about it. But it's very much the opposite. These things are set in place to protect people. So I kind of want to introduce like services in Armenia and early interventions that are available there. But I do want to share some data from UNICEF that says that less than 1/3 of registered young children with disabilities in Armenia attend any form of preschool education, while 2/3 of them do not have access to rehabilitation services. So they also say that 8 out of 10 children in the villages do not receive early childhood education. And these statistics are from 2 years ago. I can only assume that these statistics are a little bit worse now, considering what's going on there. But in general, it's said that 70% of the children in the country don't receive the care and education that would allow them to reach their full potential and have the chance to live healthy and productive lives. I think what's also important to note here is that what we recognize as full potential in Los Angeles is very different than what is available in Armenia to begin with. So these numbers would look very different if we were the ones conducting this data with the assessments that we had or things like that, and we'll also get into that later. But some things that do exist in Armenia are early childhood developmental centers. So these are usually for pregnant mothers and young children. It includes prenatal care, promotion of child nutrition, micronutrient supplementation, parenting education, and preschool education. So it's not nearly as detailed as the first slide that I showed you all, but these do exist, and autism centers are also something that are popping up more readily in Armenia these days, which is quite wonderful. I personally cannot speak on what they actually do, if there's like ABA or floor time therapy, or if it's just talk therapy, but the fact that they're starting to pop up means it exists and people are aware, and that's definitely a good thing. And just other interventions, like they do have speech therapists, they do have physical therapists, they do have occupational therapists. I think the one thing that's really missing is the neuropsychological piece and the assessments that we have. And again, I'll have a little talk about that later. But in general, I do want to broach the topic of what are the implications of avoidance, like what happens to our children and to the teens, and eventually these people become adults. And one of the greatest things is continued impairment. If you never work on the thing that was the problem, it doesn't really go away. We can't go on living saying like boys will be boys and they'll grow out of it, or it's okay. Like, you know, I talked when I was 8, my kids should talk when they're 8 too. Like, that's not how it works. So continued impairment is a thing. This continues to affect these children. It increases the risk of co-occurring disorders. And what this means is that essentially, if you're not treating one thing, other things sometimes fall behind as well. So for example, if a child has ADHD that goes untreated, it's very likely that they start developing learning disorders, where over 40% of children with ADHD will have one learning disorder. So it's important to kind of target what's going on to prevent more loss in the future. Something that's extremely common with children and adolescents is low self-esteem, which essentially this is related to the anxiety and the depression and the little autonomy that they feel when they do have to rely on their parents for a very long time, because they aren't taught the skills, or they aren't given those like social skills classes to make friends themselves. So lack of social skills is also there. Lack of friends is real. Bullying in school is something that's just happened forever and ever, and something that probably will happen forever. But a lot of these social skills classes teach you how to respond to certain situations, or if you do work on those skills, say someone has a speech sound disorder, and which is essentially a really bad lisp, kids will make fun of you in school. The correct thing as a parent to do is like, let's fix this so other people aren't harming our children's mental health, essentially. So academic difficulties are also like implied with avoidance. If we're not targeting the math or the reading or the writing, it just continues to become worse as it goes. And there are subjects like math that it builds upon each other. So if you failed like addition, chances are you're probably going to have a hard time with everything that comes later. So that being said, continued family stress is a very real thing. We know that when one child in the home is experiencing something, whether it's mental illness, whether it's physical illness, the stress is for the family and not for that child alone. So even though there's this idea that if we don't talk about it, if we brush it under the rug, then it must mean that it doesn't exist. It just prolongs how long the family is going to experience this stress if we don't work on the thing that's the issue. When we talk about like what are future directions, what are things we can do, I think it's extremely important that we start reducing stigma within our communities. And some of the ways that you do it is you post about it, you talk about it, you read about it, you recognize your own biases, and you normalize it. When we start using like people first language and stuff, you start to see those stigmas breaking apart. It's really important that, you know, a lot of the times people will say like, who's going to see this, or who's going to like understand what I'm trying to say. But sometimes it just takes one person to convince another person, and that tends to like have a domino effect. So it's really important that we become like, we become the ones in our communities that try to push out of those bounds and really expose people to it. And one of the ways to do this is by studying it deeply. So teaching it, researching, and publishing data, especially because of what I said earlier about the fact that we are pretty non-existent in a lot of ways in the research out there. And becoming a service provider, I think, is extremely important. And I think I've learned as like an Armenian service provider that a lot of the times our family members may not want to seek treatment, but once it is with another Armenian, there's automatically like a different level of comfort. So if we have that availability, that makes people more likely to seek out that service. And then I think one of the other things that is going to be the most important is just doing things that have not been done before. We have to be the ones to break the cycles. We have to be the first in the family that goes to therapy, or the first in the family that acknowledges the child's like differences with a certain subject, or difficulties with speech, or difficulties with motor. We have to be the ones that say, I don't care about what our community has decided. I don't care about what other people think. Like, I need to get these services. Again, it has like very big trickle effect. When one person does it, it then becomes normalized. I think it's super important to like develop programs. And what I mean by that is similar to like what happened when the war started 2 years ago, where Dr. G, you were part of this, getting like Armenians to provide like trauma response services to whoever was in Armenia. I think was an incredible idea. And I think it's just important to at least try to do some of these things, whether it may or may not come to fruition, who knows, but it's important to at least like shoot your shot and try to take something even here. You don't have to necessarily take it to Armenia. Even within our own community, it's important to get people involved and just do things. And I think one of the things that's going to be most beneficial personally is just norming assessments in our native language. I spent forever trying to Google an IQ test in Armenian and to see if that exists. And I was like 99% sure it doesn't, but I think Google agrees with me. Dr. ChatGPT also agrees with me, where this just does not exist. And I think it's extremely important for this specific thing, an IQ test, to exist. But it's not just that. There's many assessments that we have that provide wonderful data that has made life easier, and it has given much direction to what to do next, where to go, who to see. So I think it's extremely important that we start like doing this. So this is just like a call to all the Armenians that are watching this right now. If anyone wants to do this someday, just call me up. I need some people to recruit. So, and that's part of it. Like, just as a community, just encouraging each other, helping each other out, doing the dissertation projects that our friends and peers and students have, and making sure that we do every survey that we can to be helpful in some way or another. All of that matters. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you all for tuning in. If you have any questions, I would love to provide you with some answers if I can.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Babayan. Great presentation. And your last comment about this finding translated or standardized scores for in Armenian language for this IQ test, and you were asking psychologists to join you. I think your prayers are answered. We have Dr. Karamian, and and his presentation is, I believe, it's relevant to what you were asking, and I hope you two will work together. And I'm happy to also join. And I think it is very important issue to for our community to have those scores, the standardized translated scores. So, but in regard to the questions, I'm also very curious to see what audience think, and if they have any questions. Please, the ones who are joining us via Facebook Live, if you have questions, type your questions on that Facebook Live chat box, and we will try to respond to your questions if we have time, and as many as we can. But even if you type it later, hopefully our presenters will see your questions on our Facebook page, and they will respond it. So our next presenter is Dr. Karamian. I'll introduce Dr. Karamian. Dr. Karamian is a core faculty member at California School of Professional Psychology, Alliant International University since 2021. Dr. Karamian is a graduate of Pepperdine University and completed his internship at the ERI Consortium, where he worked primarily in physical medicine, serving as a neuropsychology and rehabilitation psychology intern. He then moved on to complete his postdoctoral training at the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center, where he continued his clinical work in physical medicine as a rehabilitation and neuropsychology fellow. During his time at OSU, Dr. Karamias worked alongside experts in the fields of traumatic brain injury and stroke rehabilitation. He also participated in various capacities within two model systems projects, including a spinal cord injury and traumatic brain injury. Dr. Karamia's most recent publication, entitled Effectiveness of Virtual Reality and Gaming Based Interventions for Upper Extremity Rehabilitation Post Stroke, a meta analysis, which was published in the Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. Dr. Karamia's presentation title for today is called Multiculturalism in Neuropsychology and Cultural Specific Normalization. So, Dr. Karamias, we are ready for your presentation, and then also just again reminder for the audience who are joining us via Facebook Live, please type your questions for our presenters and we will try to respond to the questions, as many as we can. Dr. Karamias, please go ahead and for your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Gerbian. Thank you for the introduction. That was I did all that, huh? That sounds like a lot. So when Dr. Gerbian asked me to give this talk and really have a lot of time to come up with like a big, groundbreaking idea. But this topic is important, as Dr. Babayan was saying. And this is something that I go on a diatribe on with my students, and my frustration with companies like Pearson, who publish instruments like the IQ test, the WACE. And so there is a little bit of math. So I'll explain the math. Don't run away. Don't run away. I'll explain the math. So the title is Neuropsychology and Culture Specific Norms. So actually, let me just shrink my cameras here. And culture specific norms, and by norms, we mean normalization data. So first, we kind of have to talk about what normalization data is, because Dr. Gerbian told me a little bit about the audience, and I think that a vast majority of the audience may not be familiar with what normalization data is. So I'll use an example to illustrate this. And it's a fairly simple example. Normalization data is finding out a way to compare the individual patient score to a certain population. Okay, so you're taking a patient score and converting it to a standard type of what's called a standard score, whether it's a Z-score, whether it's a scaled score. And in that way, you're saying where they fall within the population. So let's look at an example. Let's say you create a memory test, okay? And it's got 100 questions, it's got 100 items, okay? And let's pretend that it's valid and reliable, and you've already done the Cronbach's alpha and the validity, the divergent, convergent, all that stuff, discriminant, convergent, it's valid. And then you administer it to a patient, a single patient, and that patient scores a 55. So they get 55 correct out of 100, and that's a 55%, right? Here's where I would, if this was interactive, where I would ask you guys, what do you think is 55 a good score? And this would be what we call a raw score, okay? Well, 55 in a class, if this was like grade school, you'd fail. Anything under, I think what, usually 60 is an F. So this person essentially got an F, right? All right, so not such a good memory, okay? So here's me asking you if this is a good score. Okay, now let's keep going. Now you take the same test, you take the same instrument that you've developed, and you administer it to 1,000 individuals. You just healthy individuals, mentally healthy, physically healthy, and we'll call that the comparison population. Okay, this is the population when the patient gets a score on the test, the population to which you compare the patient score. Okay, and so what you do is you administer it to 1,000 individuals. You calculate the mean, which is just average, right? You just add up the scores and divide by 1,000, right? That's pretty simple. And then you determine the standard deviation, which is you get the mean and you subtract that mean from each data unit, each 1,000 each of the 1,000 individual scores that you have, and then you go on and you get your sum of squares, and then you get your standard deviation. That's that. It's just kind of basic arithmetic used to develop. So then you have the mean and the standard deviation, and you find out after administering to 1,000 individuals that the average person out of those 1,000 scored a mean of 33 on that test with a standard deviation of 6.2, right? Okay, so now the average person scored a 33, and so now you have some normalization data, right? That's what normalization data is. So now looking at the patient who scored a 55, you start to see that just looking at the 55 without the normalization data is meaningless. That's what we say, the raw score is meaningless. That's why when a patient asks you while you're administering an IQ test or any kind of an instrument, am I doing okay? You really aren't lying when you say you can't say. I mean, most of the time you can tell if they're doing well or not, but usually you don't give any kind of feedback. I just say you're doing fine. But really, it's the truth. The raw score, which is what you have by the end of the administration of the instrument, is truly meaningless. You have to look at the normalization data. And by the way, the normalization data is stratified by age and sometimes even age and education. So, a 65-year-old is getting only, 20% of the stuff of the questions correct, and it might seem like they're doing bad. But when you compare them to other elderly people, to people their age, you see that they're doing pretty okay. All right. So that's normalization data. Is you need a reference point essentially, and you can see if you do the calculation, which is your patient score, the guy that scored 55 minus the population mean, okay, equals 22. 22 divided by 6.2 is about 3.5. This means that this guy that scored 55 is 3.5 standard deviations above the mean. And what that means is, just to give you some idea of what that means, one standard deviation is statistically significant, and typically 1.5 standard deviations, you're clinically significant. So this person is now, with a score of 55, has an exceptional memory. They would be in the top 99 percentile probably of the general public. And this is what we call a Z-score. Okay, so this is a Z-score is a type of standard score. By the way, there's also a type of standard score that's actually called the standard score, and that's what we use with the IQ test. We get the FSIQ is a standard score, which is, confusingly enough, is a type of standard score. But the Z-score is what's most commonly used in neuropsychology with our pure core neuropsych instruments, which, by the way, does not include the IQ tests. We don't really consider the WAIS a neuropsych instrument. Aspects of it are neuropsychologically, like the arithmetic, working memory, processing speed, are neuropsych tests, but overall, we don't consider that a pure neuropsych test. So anyway, moving on. I don't know why it does this every time, but okay. So what's the problem with this way of doing things, of administering it to just the average population, just randomly pick 1,000 individuals, which Pearson with the WAIS does 2,100, okay? 2,100 individuals. The problem arises when your patient is vastly different than the population to which you're comparing them. Okay, and so I won't read the quote by this gentleman, Doug Armenian. It's from the book Ethnicity and Family Memory. But in the Armenian community, there's a heightened wariness of what's called outsiders. And you know, on an instrument like the MMPI, would an Armenian individual look paranoid or xenophobic, or would they look different in some way? And I'm sure there's a bunch of dissertation. My dissertation was on this topic, which I abandoned because it was too big of a project for a dissertation at the time for me, and I did something else. But for example, Native American cultures have spirit animals and have rituals where they have visions. Are they going to look on a MMPI, which is a test of personality? Are they going to look like they're psychotic? Because they're going to report, yes, I do see things that other people don't see, right? They're going to stay true to that. And the frustrating thing is, and I'm going to say this again, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, but Pearson does collect data on multiple ethnicities. And I'll show you, or not Pearson, but the Pearson waste people and MMPI3 people, they do get ethnic specific norms. They just don't separate them out, okay? And I'll show you, I think, in the next slide, what ethnicities they shoot for. But they do it based on the US Census. So if the US Census, the latest US Census says 20% of the American population are Asian, then they stratify their data, their sample. It's a stratified sample where 20% of that 2,100, the sample, would be of an Asian culture. And they don't break those Asian cultures, for example, down into the subcultures, which is also even more problematic. So this is how they do it. And a potential solution is, hey, since you're already collecting the data, even though it's stratified based on the census, why not separate out the norms, and not just for age, but for ethnicity and culture and race also. You know, I've looked for the answer for this, because when you compare an individual like an Armenian, who is Dr. Rabian's saying, or not very well represented, you're going to get you're going to over pathologize or under pathologize, and you're not going to get at the true characteristics of that individual, or in an IQ test at that person's true abilities. Okay, and so it's problematic. And these are the populations. This is for the MMPI3, and it's based on, I believe, the 2020 census. I don't know which census this one is based on, but these are the populations that they cover. Okay, but again, when you're putting in your patient's scores, your patient is getting compared to the full 1620 of the individuals. Okay, they could easily break it up into, like, if your patient is Black or Hispanic, they could compare them to just the other Hispanic participants, which makes it more fair. They don't do that. Okay, and the explanation is that their reasoning is, we don't separate it out because when we control for cultural and socioeconomic factors, statistically, when we control for those, the differences go away. And so that's a bit frustrating. That's good for the ivory tower where in the laboratory where they do the research, and they can statistically control for things. How do you control for that in what I call the trenches, in the clinics and the hospitals where we're doing the work? And I mean, I'm an academic. I wouldn't call that the trenches, but definitely when you're working in a hospital or in the clinical setting, that's the trenches. And so, how do you control for that as a clinician when you're doing the clinical work? Okay, do I just say, could you please? Here's the instrument. Please fill this out. This MMPI-3. But could you please try to stop being Armenian and just please stop? Just forget your cultural beliefs for the hour, 45 minutes or whatever it's going to take you to do that. That's not reasonable. That doesn't work. So it's kind of frustrating. And again, my students have heard me, go on and on about this, this problem. With the bigger instruments that are not neuropsych instruments, because with the neuropsych instruments, we do have things like the compendium. This used to be called Spreen and Strauss because the authors were named Spreen and Strauss. Now the fourth edition, the authors have changed. So we're going to call it the compendium now, I guess. The compendium takes essentially studies that people have done on specific cultures, right? And those papers have essentially the means and standard deviations in a table. And so they take those papers, they take the tables, and they put them in this book. And it's a massive book. I mean, it's like, you could exercise with this, you could lift weights with it. It's a massive book. So here's an example of something of one of the tables from this book, this resource. You can see this is finger tapping, which is not going to be radically different across cultures, but this is by age for Japanese Americans. And you can see here's the N. There was 58 men between 70 and 79. The mean is 42 taps, and the standard deviation is 8.3. So you could easily, if your patient is Japanese, you could easily go to this book and take your mean, take your patient score, subtract the mean, and then divide it by the standard deviation to get your Z-score. And then now you've compared your Japanese male to other Japanese males of the same age. Okay, and you can see they're kind of a couple age ranges, male and female. So this is a potential solution. And we've been doing this in the neuropsych, again, the pure neuropsych instruments like the finger tapping and Boston naming and all the trails A and B. We've been doing this for years. It's old news to us. But yet the IQ tests, the MMPIs, the bigger instruments published by Pearson, they don't have this kind of data. So that's why neuropsychologists have to turn to resources like the compendium to get the information that we need. Okay. This is also another solution, neuropsychnorms.com, which I helped develop when I was at Cedars-Sinai. And I think Dr. Christina Yamakawa, who I believe I invited her, she may be in the audience. She also, I believe, helped with this. This website essentially takes, whenever someone publishes a paper like this, where this table was from an article, they can send that paper to neuropsychnorms.com. And if they pass all the rigorous tests, like all the rigorous requirements that the authors have, then those norms get added to the website so that when you log in and you type in the demographic and the instrument that you want, it gives you basically tables like this in order of best fit. By the way, I skipped something. I wanted to talk about this real quick. In using this method, see this is the N is 18. This is probably not going to be symmetrical, so that's problematic. A lot of neuropsychologists, I shouldn't say a lot, I should say I've come across a couple people who would use this. I would not use this because 18, again, if the data isn't symmetrical, 18 people is not enough probably not enough to get. Your data is probably going to be skewed or kurtotic. And if it is skewed or kurtotic, the Z-score is going to be meaningless. because that's not the skewed data doesn't represent the population. Okay, so just to be clear, if you're going to use this method or a book like the compendium, make sure the N is large enough. I would say probably above 30 is a good rule of thumb. Above, look for above 30. Above 30, you still might have some skewed kurtosis, whatever, but there's much better chance that the data is going to be symmetrical. Okay, so why give this talk? Just like Dr. Balayan did, I encourage you all out there to engage in this kind of research. And if you publish articles on the Armenian community, please put the table in this format in the article so that authors like these good people here can take those, and people like Dr. Enrique Lopez can include it on their website, neuropsychnorms.com. So yeah, so that's it. Any comments, questions, cries of heresy, anything like that?
Thank you so much, Dr. Karamians. Great presentation. I'm very excited about this, both of your presentations, and the feedback that we have received so far. It's all positive. There are lots of messages of appreciation and encouragement for both of you to continue this work. We have some questions and some comments I'll share, and whoever wants to respond, please feel free to respond. So one of our audience has asked, I'm curious if you have any ideas on ways that folks outside the Armenian community can support your drive to both address stigma as well as get existing batteries adapted.
I think I can start speaking on this question because one of the topics that I looked into in my actual dissertation on Armenians was how to get Armenians to trust other people outside of themselves, how to get them in therapy, or how to encourage them to stay in therapy. And one of the most important things was to recognize who they are, know their history, understand like what it means to them or why they have stigma against it. In general, most of what I found just said that in order to get Armenians to want to work with you, in order to get Armenians
stigma against it.
Sorry.
I think we're good now. In general, one of the main ways to get Armenians to fight the stigma, get involved in therapy, get involved in assessment, is to just approach Armenians as people who you know, and that means to really understand their history and the implications of really who they are and where they come from.
Dr. Karamians, do you want to?
Yeah, I would just say, I would just say educate. If you're at a conference, if you're presenting on something at a conference, bring this up. Have a few slides on it. Talk about the importance of it, and publish. Always publish and educate people that way. Even books. There's a lot of great books out there. Dr. Kim Finney and I are working on a paper on presenting racism as a form of mental illness so that it could be put in the DSM potentially. It's a theoretical paper. We plan on talking about it in there. I'm writing a book chapter for her in her book. And there's a chapter, that chapter is going to be on Armenians. So just educate.
And I think for the second half of the question that said how other people can participate in our endeavors to getting existing batteries adapted, I think at some point we're gonna have, if people actually go through with this, it's gonna be important to get like the support of other people, and it's not just us asking for this, but it's also just other people acknowledging the fact that this is a need. This is an area that needs to be further explored.
Yeah, Yeah, definitely. And as we were talking about collaboration, also many people conveyed the message that they are also happy to collaborate with this project of finding standardized scores for the Armenian community. And we have a message. It says, "I hope you well no. How can I collaborate with you as an ICF individual and team?" Uh, I mean, I was trying to understand what ICF is, but I'm not sure if does anyone know what
I
ICF.
don't know what that is.
Yeah,
Dr. B, you're laughing, so I'm
yeah,
wondering if you know what it is.
I found something that said, I just sent it to you guys, International Coaching Federation. I don't know if that's what we're talking about, but
yeah. So,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I don't think that's it.
yeah,
I don't
Okay.
think that's it.
So, okay.
it's
So
better
whatever.
financial federation or something like that. So.
Okay, whatever that is, please, the person who has commented, like, contact us. And I just want to also take advantage of this question and let everybody know that, please, if you are interested in collaborating with us, if you are in a in psychology, in a mental health field, please join us. Join AMHA's association. We have you can find our membership form on our website, amhawest.org, AAMHAWEST.org, and contact us. We will link you to our presenters, and if our psychologists, our mental health professionals, we can work together. It will help us to grow and to improve our work, and as we were discussing today, to have a more stronger work, and as we said, like, we can address these issues that we have. So I have a question. I can also check the comments again, but I have a question. I thought maybe both of you can. I don't know if anyone can respond to this question. So to me, we have also this cultural differences amongst ourselves. Like, we have Armenians from Armenia, Armenians from Iran, Armenians from Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, other countries that come to US, and some they are who are in their own countries now. And we have other Armenians who identify themselves as Armenians, but they are also acculturated. They've been moved to either the US or to Europe, and they identify themselves as Armenians. So I was wondering, what would be your thoughts about when we are talking about standardizing the scores for the Armenian community? Which group we are going to standardize this scores for? Or is it going to be for one group, or we combine them? I wonder if anyone has any thought about this issue.
Well, ideally, we would do separate studies or separate collection of normalization data for each population, but and that sounds like it would be quite a project. But I think if when there's multiple researchers involved, I don't think it would be a problem. Each researcher could do one culture, but another solution would be to just again. Do like the Pearson people are, do it stratified based on the different populations. Each section, each strata would be one subculture under the Armenian umbrella. So those are a couple solutions that I don't know if Dr. B has any ideas.
Yeah, I think ideally if we were able to like do it all separately, I think that would make the most sense, because their dialects are very different, but also like the cultural background is very different. It's not just the language, it's also what you know. For example, like on the WAIS and WISC, like the information subtest is it asks these questions that even within America, lots of people don't agree that these are like good questions to ask for it to be like a general consensus of the whole state, let alone like what Dr. Gribian mentioned, that with Armenians, even though there's not that many of us, we come in very different like shapes and sizes. So it's I think it would be ideal if we could find like a middle ground, something that everyone agrees on, or to do what Dr. Karamian's also said.
All right, thank you very much, both of you, for your responses. I don't see any other question in the chat box, so I think you can stay for a couple more minutes if there are other questions. But let's see if anyone who is listening to us right now, if you have questions, please type them on our Facebook page. That we can ask our presenters. But as we are waiting, like I also I have another question. Maybe we can respond if like as we are waiting. So also we hear that some families, some parents are worried that if they have their children to be tested, the records of their mental health, their children's mental health records will stay there in the system, and they're worried about that. That's like there's going to be some diagnosis or some scores, and what the government or the system is going to do with that data, like that creates this anxiety, worries of for some parents not to have their children to be taking them to be tested, assessed, or at least not to be tested officially to have records. So is there anything you can again tell you can say about this and address this issue, reduce the worries of these parents, or if this is even a true thing, true worry?
I think like I briefly touched on this, and what I've learned in my experience has been that getting the testing, getting the diagnosis is something that helps you. It's meant to be there to protect your children. It doesn't prevent them from becoming doctors and lawyers and pharmacists and all the other good things in life. It's more to assure that your children are able to get there. So I personally find it that the more dangerous, the more harmful thing for a child would to be to not get services, to not get school to help, because that is the kind of thing that inspires a child to not want to go to school, to drop out, to feel ostracized, to feel different, to feel dumb, to feel like low self-esteem and all these things. So at the end of it, I really do think it's like a cost benefit, whether or not we will end up knowing the costs fully 30 years down the line. Regardless, that's how you keep your kids in school. That's how you keep your kids engaged. That's how you assure that they even get to higher education a lot of the times with some of the difficulties that they have. So I think the real question is like, what's going to help my child? What's going to help them? And is it going to hinder them more if I don't do this for them? So I think it's just really important to consider like the other side of it, of what happens if we don't do this. Because the what ifs are endless of what could happen, but we do know that if we do this, we know what that entails, and that's really services and assistance and help and accommodations, and that carries through, whether it's community college or grad school or elementary school, or at some point in life, it's things much higher than that. And I personally don't know anyone who's been like reprimanded or lost out opportunities for having any diagnoses, but I'll let Dr. Karamians also give his spiel.
Thank you. I think that's a so first of all, you know that there's HIPAA and educate them about HIPAA and how the records are protected. But I think the bigger issue is this stigmatization of the diagnosis. I don't work with children ever, but there's a few times where at the hospitals it's a 16, 17-year-old, and I had this young woman who's had some very, very strange behaviors, some very disinhibited behaviors and I won't go into it, but neuroleptics weren't working. The antipsychotic medications just weren't working. So they put it to us to do the neuropsych testing, and kind of baffled by it because she's too young for it to be a first break psychosis. The medication is not working, which it usually does. And we're just kind of baffled by it. So the diagnosis my supervisor came up with ended up being Lennox-Gastaut, which is a type of childhood seizure disorder. And yeah. So anyway, I didn't agree with that diagnosis. I don't, again, not a child person, but I think 16 is too old. It would have resolved by that point. But the idea was that there were frontal seizures her entire childhood, which destroyed the frontal lobe, and that's where this disinhibition was coming from. And guess what? The parents, who were not Armenian, but they were from, they were Indian, were actually happy. They were actually happy that it was a neurological condition and not a psychiatric condition. They literally wiped their brow and said, wow, that's a relief. Even though the condition is the same, and we're talking about, necrosis of brain matter, and a much more serious condition that can't really be addressed medically, they were still relieved because it was not a psychiatric condition. It was a neurological condition. And so that's the core of that question is getting rid of that stigma. That the brain is just another organ. You're not going to feel shame if your liver is malfunctioning. Why do you feel shame when your brain metabolism is off? So it's getting at that, I think, is the core of that question there.
Thank you so much. Great responses. Yeah, it's very important to have this knowledge about mental health disorders and destigmatize the mental health problems. And so with that, let's close our session. And I want to take this a moment and express my appreciation of both of your presentations, Dr. Babayan and Dr. Karamian's, and also thank our audience for being with us, listening and asking their questions, sending their supportive messages, and also thank my colleagues in AMHA, Armenian American Mental Health Association, that they all helped us to create this conference. And one more time, I want to invite our psychology students, mental health professionals to join us. We have the forms at amhawest.org to be a member and support us and let us work together to help our community. And with that, I want to thank again everyone, all presenters today, and our audience. And I hope that everybody has a good evening if they are listening us right now, or later. Have a good day. Have a good weekend, and I hope we see you next year. And also in our other events, we also have AMHA's events. Once a month we usually have a talk. Please follow us on our Facebook page, our Instagram page, and you will be notified of our events. All right, thank you everyone. Bye bye.